All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving into some seriously intriguing stuff. We're talking about destabilization playbooks. You know, those strategies supposedly used to, well, destabilize entire nations. Sounds like something out of a spy movie, right?
Yeah, it does have that kind of a vibe, but it's a lot more real than you might think. These playbooks, both offensive and defensive, offer a glimpse into how power plays out on the global stage.
So, from what we've gathered from the intel you've sent us, these playbooks outline ways to influence nations, sometimes for good, but often, it seems, for not so good reasons.
That's right. It's about leveraging power, exploiting weaknesses, and ultimately trying to shape the world to fit a certain agenda.
It's pretty heavy stuff. So, for those just joining us, let's break it down. What exactly are these destabilization playbooks all about? How do they work?
Well, imagine a country, let's call it country A, wants to gain leverage over another country, we'll call it country B. Maybe they want to control its resources, install a friendly government, or just sow chaos and weaken it. These playbooks lay out a step-by-step plan to do just that.
Okay, so it's like a blueprint for undermining a nation, a guide to creating chaos.
You could say that. It's about exploiting vulnerabilities, amplifying existing tensions, and manipulating perceptions to create a desired outcome.
So, where does it all begin? How do you even start to destabilize an entire country?
The early stages often focus on creating internal chaos, almost like planting seeds of discord that will grow into full-blown unrest.
And one of the tactics that our sources keep highlighting is something called NGO infiltration, which, let me tell you, sounds incredibly sneaky.
It can be. The idea is to use seemingly benign, non-governmental organizations to, well, basically stir the pot. Imagine flooding a country with NGOs, some legitimate, some not so much, and using them to push a specific agenda.
One of the documents we came across put it pretty bluntly. Flood a country with NGOs, pay people to stir up discontent and have them amplify your narrative. So it's like using these organizations as a front to spread propaganda and manipulate people. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of thing.
Exactly. And it can be very effective because NGOs often have a lot of trust and goodwill within communities. They can tap into existing grievances, turn people against each other, and erode trust in the government.
And then it's not just NGOs, right? Our sources also talk about elite capture, which sounds pretty ominous.
Elite capture is all about getting influential figures on board celebrities, former military officers, even politicians.
Yeah.
You co-opt them, often through money or promises of power, and use their credibility to give legitimacy to your campaign.
So if you see a beloved actor or a respected general suddenly speaking out against their own government, you might start to question things yourself. It's all about planting those seeds of doubt.
Right, and our sources suggest these captured elites are often handsomely rewarded for their cooperation, which just further undermines public trust. It makes people think that everyone is in on it, that the whole system is rigged.
It's a pretty cynical tactic. Okay, so you've got chaos brewing, people are suspicious of each other, and they're losing faith in their leaders. What's next in this playbook?
The next phase focuses on manipulating perceptions, shaping how the public sees events. And one of the key tools here is what's called manufactured protests.
Oh, this is fascinating and kind of scary. We were reading about how even a small demonstration can be made to look like a massive uprising with the right media strategy. One document even suggested using pro-European themes to make these protests more appealing to Western audiences.
It's all about controlling the narrative. The goal is to provoke an overreaction from the government, something that can then be filmed and broadcast as evidence of a brutal regime.
It all plays into the pre-existing distrust that they've been carefully cultivating. One source put it quite starkly: ensure that the national press betrays and sells out its own country. It's chilling how deliberately they talk about controlling the media.
A compromised media is crucial for this kind of operation. It allows them to silence dissenting voices, push their own narrative, and present a completely distorted view of reality. It's information warfare at its finest.
Okay, so you've created internal chaos, you've eroded public trust, you've manipulated perceptions. At this point, the country is in turmoil. What's the end game here?
This is where it gets really interesting. The playbook talks about installing pre-selected shadow players as leaders. Basically, you engineer a regime change, putting in place people who are sympathetic to your cause.
And that's where it gets really scary. I mean, one document actually talked about using these captured states as breeding grounds for soldiers and proxies to be remotely controlled against your enemies. That's some serious Orwellian stuff right there.
It shows you the potential consequences of these tactics. It's not just about political maneuvering, it's about reshaping the geopolitical landscape. And the playbook is very clear about the importance of concealment and repetition. You leave as few traces as possible, and then you move on to the next target.
It's a pretty chilling system. But the good news is our sources also outline a counter-playbook, a set of strategies that nations can use to defend themselves against these tactics. And it seems like it all starts with unity.
That's right. A strong sense of national identity, shared values, a common purpose can be incredibly powerful. It can help people see through the manipulations and resist those divide and conquer tactics.
Our sources also stress the need to keep a close eye on NGOs, to demand transparency, to
Oh.
scrutinize their funding and activities. And if there's evidence they're being used for nefarious purposes, well, they say you need to shut them down.
It's a delicate balance, though. You want to protect against manipulation, but you don't want to stifle legitimate humanitarian work. How do you distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys? It's a question a lot of countries are grappling with.
It's a tough call. You don't want to create a climate of fear where genuine efforts to help are seen as suspicious. We're going to delve deeper into that dilemma a little later. But first, let's talk about information warfare. Because our sources are very clear. Controlling the narrative is absolutely essential to countering these destabilization efforts.
It's the battle for hearts and minds. One of the most important things a nation can do is cultivate a strong and independent media. News outlets that are committed to providing accurate information, to exposing lies and manipulation, and to helping people develop critical thinking skills.
So it's not just about having freedom of the press, it's about making sure the information circulating is reliable, and that people have the tools to spot disinformation and propaganda.
Exactly. It's about media literacy, critical thinking, and understanding that things are rarely as simple as they seem.
Okay, but it's not just about defense, right? The counter playbook also emphasizes the need to protect national institutions.
Absolutely. Institutions like the courts, the military, the government itself need to be strong and resilient. They need to be seen as trustworthy and accountable. And that can be challenging in a climate of suspicion and disinformation.
The sources highlight the importance of transparency and accountability. When governments are open and honest with their citizens, it's much harder for foreign powers to sow those seeds of doubt.
Right. It's about building trust and legitimacy. And it's also about identifying and exposing those who are actively working against their own country. Those who accept foreign money to destabilize their own nation. One source put it bluntly. Make it clear. There's no place for traitors here.
So we've got a pretty good grasp on the theory of these playbooks, both on the attack and defense. But what I'm really curious about is how these tactics play out in the real world.
Well, there are plenty of examples we could look at, unfortunately. From ongoing conflicts to political upheavals, these tactics are being used all over the world.
And I think that's what makes this so important to understand, because this isn't just some abstract theory. It's happening right now as we speak. It affects all of us.
It does. And that's why we're here today, to shed light on these tactics, to understand how they work, and to empower people to recognize them and resist their influence.
All right, well, after a quick break, let's get into some real-world examples of these destabilization tactics in action, and we'll explore what can be done to counter them.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on the playbook, the theory behind all of this. Now, I'm really curious to see how these tactics actually play out in the real world. What are some specific examples we can look at?
Well, one that's been in the headlines a lot lately, and that's mentioned quite a bit in the sources we've been looking at, is Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine. It's a complex situation for sure, with a lot of different perspectives and narratives swirling around. But if we look at it through the lens of these destabilization playbooks, does it provide any insights?
I think so. There have been a lot of questions about the role of NGOs in Ukraine. Some argue that certain NGOs have been pushing agendas that align with, say, Western interests, and potentially even fueling unrest.
So that sounds like the whole NGO infiltration thing we talked about earlier, right? Using seemingly neutral organizations to advance a hidden agenda.
Yeah, that's the idea. And it raises the question, how do you tell which NGOs are legit and which ones might be serving foreign interests?
Because you don't want to shut down groups that are genuinely trying to help people. But you also don't want to be naive and let foreign powers manipulate your country from within.
Exactly. It's a tough balance. Transparency is key. Scrutinizing funding sources, looking at the activities of these organizations, making sure they align with the nation's interests. But it's a sensitive issue.
For sure. And then, of course, there's the media's role in all of this. How's that played out in Ukraine, would you say?
Information warfare has been huge in the Ukraine conflict. You have both sides accusing each other of spreading disinformation and propaganda, trying to control the narrative.
So it's not just about bombs and bullets, it's about controlling the information people have access to and ultimately influencing how they see the world.
It's about winning hearts and minds. And it's not always about outright lies. Sometimes it's about selectively presenting information, emphasizing certain facts while downplaying others.
Spinning the story to fit a particular agenda.
Right. And then you have social media amplifying all of this, creating these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs.
It's making it harder and harder to know what to believe. So we've got NGOs, we've got media manipulation. What about elite capture? Have we seen any examples of that in Ukraine?
There have been accusations that certain Ukrainian politicians and oligarchs are being influenced or even controlled by foreign powers, but these are often very politically charged allegations, and it's hard to get to the bottom of it all.
Yeah, it gets murky. But the point is, these tactics, whether they've been used in Ukraine or not, are definitely part of a real playbook that's being used to try and manipulate nations.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for people to be aware of these tactics, to be able to spot the patterns.
So we can be more critical of the information we're bombarded with every day.
Exactly. We need to be asking questions. Who's saying this? Why are they saying it? What's their agenda?
Okay, so Ukraine is obviously a very complex situation. I'm also thinking about what's been happening in Brazil. There's been a lot of political turmoil there recently. Do you see any parallels with the tactics we've been talking about?
Brazil is interesting. And while we have to be careful about drawing direct comparisons, there are some things that stand out.
Like what?
Well, the protests and unrest following the recent election. They've raised questions about the role of social media, how it's being used to amplify discontent, potentially even incite violence.
So even if the initial protests were genuine, there's a concern that outside forces could be trying to exploit the situation to make it seem more chaotic than it really is.
Exactly. It's like pouring fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
And the goal might not be to completely overthrow the government. Sometimes it's just about weakening it, making it less stable, less able to resist outside influence.
It's kind of a disturbing thought, but is there anything that can be done to push back against these kinds of tactics? I mean, it all seems so overwhelming.
There are things that can be done. The counter-playbook we discussed offers some good strategies for building resilience, but it requires a real commitment from both governments and citizens.
What kind of commitment are we talking about?
Strengthening national institutions, promoting media literacy, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose among the population, being vigilant against attempts to exploit divisions.
So it's not just about governments passing laws or cracking down on dissent. It's about building a society that's more resistant to manipulation from within and from without.
Exactly. In the age of information warfare, we all have a responsibility to be discerning consumers of information and to participate in building a more resilient and informed society.
Well said. And I think that's a really important takeaway from all of this. We've explored some pretty dark stuff today, but it's crucial that we understand these dynamics so we can be better equipped to navigate the world and hopefully make it a little less susceptible to these kinds of manipulations. Now, I know we need to start wrapping things up, but before we do, I'd love to hear your final thoughts on all of this. What are some key takeaways for our listeners? It's pretty wild, right? I mean, thinking about how information itself can be weaponized.
Yeah, it really changes how you view things, doesn't it? The battles we're facing these days, they're not always fought on traditional battlefields. They're happening online, in the media, in the minds of people.
And it's not just governments doing this anymore, right? It feels like everyone's trying to manipulate everyone else these days.
It's true. Corporations, special interest groups, even individuals. Anyone with an internet connection can potentially use these tactics. So, yeah, we all need to be paying attention.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope? Are we all just stuck being pawns in this game?
Well, I don't think it's about breaking free entirely, because information is always going to be part of the game. It's more about understanding the rules of the game, recognizing when someone is trying to play you.
So becoming more aware, more informed.
Exactly. The more you understand these tactics, the better equipped you are to resist them, to make up your own mind, rather than letting someone else make it up for you.
Okay, so knowledge is power, but what else can we do? What are some practical steps people can take to push back against this kind of manipulation?
Well, a strong independent media is crucial. We need journalists who are committed to reporting the truth, not just pushing an agenda.
Which means we need to support good journalism. Subscribe to reputable news sources. Be willing to pay for quality content. Don't just complain about fake news. Actually do something to support the good guys.
Absolutely. And education is key too. Teaching critical thinking skills, helping people become more media literate, that needs to start early in schools.
So basically, giving people the tools to think for themselves, to question what they see and hear.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
building stronger communities is important too, because when people feel isolated, atomized, they're much more vulnerable to manipulation. But if you have strong social connections, a sense of belonging, it's harder to be swayed by propaganda.
Makes sense. So it's not just about defending ourselves, it's about building a better, more resilient society.
Right. And holding our leaders accountable, demanding transparency, integrity.
Because when the people in charge are corrupt or compromised, it makes the whole system weaker, more vulnerable to exploitation.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think it comes down to believing in the power of truth. If we can cultivate a culture that values honesty, integrity, critical thinking, we can create a more resilient and just society.
That's a great point. So it's not just about defending against the bad, it's about actively creating something better.
Well said. It's been a pleasure talking about all this with you.
This whole deep dive into destabilization playbooks has been a real eye-opener. We've learned a lot about the tactics, the dangers, and most importantly, what we can do about it.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand these forces at play, the better equipped we are to navigate this complex world.
That's right. So to everyone listening, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay vigilant. Thanks for joining us.